This is the cheat sheet review for 3 lessons, 40, 41, and 42. Let's go ahead and get started here. And the first one was understanding namespaces and the using directive. And that was CS-ASP 040. And just very briefly, although we talked about what namespaces are, we can state it rather simply. Namespaces, did I ever spell that right? Yeah, spaces disambiguate class names inside of class libraries or applications. All right, so you must reference class names by their full name whenever you use them, like so: system.text.string builder sb equals new system.text.string builder. Or you can employ a using directive at the top of the code file to instruct the compiler to look in those namespaces to find the class that is referenced. Okay, so you do this using system.text and then other code here, and then you can just do string builder sb equals new string builder, like so, and it will be happy. Okay. And you must always do one of these two things if the code that you're writing is outside of the namespace of the class that you want to use, even if it's in the same project. All right? And then we talked about the default namespace. It's defined in project properties, and you can get there by just clicking on project name in the Solution Explorer, and then select the properties option. It's at the very bottom. All right, next up, the next lesson was creating class libraries and adding references to assemblies. CS-ASP 041. And this was a pretty simple lesson all in all. It was a lot of action, but the lesson you can learn in a nutshell is that a class library project creates a .dll that can be referenced in other projects. And so in order to use a class library, no matter whether it's something that you created or Microsoft created, you have to add a reference to it. And so with regards to the framework class library, it's split into tiny pieces. You know what I mean? It's split into a lot of different assemblies, and we saw that whenever we looked at the C:/Windows/Microsoft.net/ and then I kind of forget the rest. I need some prompts. But we saw all of those .dll files, each one that had system.something.dll, right? So where are we here? Oh, pieces, yes. And you must reference the assemblies that contain the parts of the library that you want to use. All right. And so to add a reference to a assembly, whether it's something that you created, a third party created, or Microsoft created, you have to right click on the project's references node in the Solution Explorer, and then select add reference from the contextual menu. Okay. Finally, we talked about accessibility, easy for me to say, huh? Accessibility modifiers, fields, and properties. And this was CS-ASP 042. And there was an article that outlined all of this, and you should go to v.gd/access to find that article. All right, and so basically there's public, private, protected, internal, and then there was like protected internal. I think I've never used that one. But public means that the class or the member that you're attaching this to or adorning the definition with can be accessed by any code. Okay. Private's kind of the opposite of that. The class or member can only be accessed by a parent class. Protected has to do with inheritance, and I didn't want to talk much about that, but in a nutshell, the class or member can only be accessed by the parent class or derived class. And then finally, internal means that the class or the member can only be accessed by code inside the same assembly or project or whatever you want to call it there. And I said that by default classes are internal by default, and that methods and properties are private by default. All right. Then we talked about encapsulation a bit, and basically, to give it a really brief definition, it's hiding implementation details behind public interfaces. It reduces coupling, increases plugability, or maybe you could call this reusability, maintainability, and so on. Okay. And encapsulation is generally a good thing. It's one of the 3 or 4 tenets of object-oriented programming. All right, and so there's a couple of different ways to achieve encapsulation. Obviously, using the accessibility modifiers plays a big role in this, but also the use of private fields and public properties, like the full definition of each, especially of properties. So private fields have 2 purposes, and maybe I should show what a private field is. Well, we will in just a moment. Here, we'll just do it this way. So private fields, they should either be to hold a reference to an object or variable that's used for internal implementation of the class. So, for example, the random class, we held on to a private object reference called random, and then we use that whenever the roll method was used on the dice class, right? So that's your first scenario. The second scenario is that a private field will hold the state of an object, and by state I mean that, for example, let's say you had a car class and you have a year property, a make, model, a color property. The state of that object is the sum total of all of the settings and its properties. And so you can change the state of it by setting new values for each of the properties in your class or in your new object instance. And so private fields can hold the current state of an object, and really what this comes down to, it becomes a backing field for a public property. And then we did prop full tab, and that was a code snippet to that basically created a full-blown property, and I'll just go ahead and type it out. My field and property int my property, and then we can do get return my field. So that will retrieve the private backing field for the property. But the set is a little bit different and more interesting. We can, for example, use this as a gatekeeper to restrict what values can our given property can be set to. So we can restrict how other code sets the state of our object. So the most simple example I could think of was to go if value is greater than 100, and in this case, the value is what's being passed into the set method, the setter on the given property. So if we were to do my object dot my property equals Bob, all right, so this is when we would be evaluating this. Bob would be passed in as the value in this case. So if it's greater than 100, that might be one of our business rules, then we can set it to whatever the value is that's been passed in. However, if it's not greater than 100, then we would probably need to tell the code that called it that they can't do this. All right. And so you would use the full property definition and private fields to control access to the private fields or the state of the object. Okay. And also we looked at another code snippet called prop G tab, and that one will create a read-only property, so it makes the set private. So it will look something like this if you type that out: my property and then get and then private set, like so. And this will restrict the setting of property to just the class's internal implementation. So only one of the members of the class itself into which this property belongs can modify the value of my property. You can't set it from any code that has a reference to the class that contains my property. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the what we've talked about in the last 3 lessons. Quite a bit of good stuff, and let's keep pushing forward. Doing great. Hang in there. See you in the next lesson. Thanks.